Welcome to the end of Fear and the Politics of Tribalism. It's a pretty light topic, probably the lightest of this entire series. And I have to be very honest about it. There's probably no talk that I've wound up giving more thought to since I wrote it, which was a really long time ago. And in fact, maybe it might surprise you, it was long before the election. And in fact, what motivated me to do it was not so much the political framework as different cultural pockets that I started to see developing. And I wanted to, in my mind, I was going through that a lot. And so I'd like to kind of speak about that. And in the end, just so you have a sense of what the end of this conversation is, it's really about individualism. How do we thrive as individuals? How does society move forward based on our approach and what we look at, how we look at the world, how we adopt our perspectives? Are they truly enlightened, or are they informed by the people we feel the most comfortable with? And this is really a question that I have to address as a teacher and a philosopher. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, but I have a family. And as Katie mentioned, I do have a family, one of whom is here, my youngest. I have 4 children and a wife, and so I have my own little tribe, so to speak. So let's try and set the framework and the course. And in fact, when I feel a lot of pressure, I come with notes, which I did this time. And when I have 4 pages, it's either going to be really good, or I'm just going to deviate off the notes, or it's going to be really bad. And before I go any further, let me just say this. To have a conversation like this, and I've struggled to find a way to address it, in which I can kind of cover the terrain and also speak to the solutions, which I think there are some. In terms of our social climate, our political climate, I do think there are solutions for all of us have to step into, that all of us individually will have to step into. And enough of us will have to do it for us to reach a tipping point where we do make a difference in the way we look at our relationship to society and culture and politics. But no matter how much I thought about this conversation, and no matter how many times I ran it in my mind and then began to reach out to individuals who I thought might lend me some expanded perspective, I realized there's no way I can have this conversation without making generalizations. So ahead of time, what I'm going to do is apologize for the groups that you identify with, or the very nature of tribalism and culturalism, and just say there is no way to have this conversation with it being perfectly neat. All right, so apologies from me to begin with, and even worse, I'm a white guy, old, semi-privileged. I grew up the child of Europeans, and so I kind of won the lottery ticket as it relates to our cultural point of view. I'm well aware that we live in a patriarchal society, so already we've alienated at least half of our population, of which I'm a part of the offending party. So those are my caveats going ahead. So I'm like apologizing for what's about to happen. We'll see if that's necessary or not as we go along. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of read a list. And I just did this about 2 hours ago, and just a quick list here. Young presidents. Do you guys know what that is? Those are people who become CEOs under the age of 30. Hell's Angels. Most of us know what the Hell's Angels are. Quilting Circles. You familiar with Quilting Circles? Yeah. Women who wind up in quilting circles live longer than women who don't, by the way. Holocaust deniers. AA. Soccer hooligans. Mensa. Do you guys know Mensa? So this is the high IQ society. Burning Man. And then all of the Burning Man individual camps. As I understand, there's cultures within that culture, subcultures within the culture of Burning Man. Is that ringing a bell to anyone here? Perhaps. Goddess circles, men's groups, wife-swapping swinging clubs, the Sierra Club, bowling leagues, classic car fan clubs, Real Housewives of whatever city it is fans, and Rotary, the Rotary Club. You know about the Rotary Club. These are all mini tribes. And really, everywhere you look, we gather as tribes in various ways. And again, I want to take it for a little time out of the politics of this, because again, politics didn't inspire this talk. And so let's define tribes. Tribes are basically a group of people who have the same language, customs, or beliefs, a common character, common occupation, or a common interest. And so, in my research about this, what we find out is that we're tribal. The reason we're tribal, in part, is because those of us who had this gene of proclivity, a gene that gave us the proclivity to want to connect to other individuals, we lived more and we lived longer, and the process of evolution meant that we're the ones who actually survived. And those kind of loner people who actually didn't want to be part of a tribe, and in fact, not even part of the tribe that didn't want to be part of a tribe, so you were really alone, because there's always a tribe that doesn't want to be part of the tribe, but they hang out as kind of iconoclastic tribe members, right? They become a tribe. But really, people who didn't want tribe at all, didn't even want to be in the tribe or didn't want to be part of a tribe. We simply lived. Our ancestors lived better, longer, and evolution over time ensured that most of us would have this tribe gene. So at some level, we all have this proclivity. All of us here are the outcome of the success of being tribal. And so there are elements that really made it so. One is that chances are you survived longer. Someone was cooking and figuring out the fire, and someone was on the hunt, and someone was preparing, and someone was taking care of the kids. That tribal mentality ensured better rates of survival than those who didn't believe or follow that or didn't have that proclivity. But there's other things aside from survival. There's this idea that there's strength in numbers, either perceived or real. That if I had a culture and there was more in our culture than there was in another culture and we were fighting for limited resources, there's a good chance that the people with more wound up surviving more than those that didn't. Today, at least in Western civilization, there isn't as much competition for survival. But we still have some of those same genes. And yet it is, in fact, that tribal mentality that is the source of so much war, violence, our preparedness to send children into hostile territories and try and kill each other. Boy, this is such a yogic concept, such a yogic topic. And there's other aspects. So one is survival, another is culture, the impact of a tribe in preserving culture. I myself teach and practice something that's survived for at least 5,000, maybe closer to 8,000 years old, pre-Vedic wisdom. And if it wasn't for culture and tribe, that knowledge would not be preserved. But there's also other types of culture. We can think of art, we can think of religion, we can think of spirituality, we can think of handicrafts, we can think of cottage industries, we can think of so many things that really tribes have helped to maintain. If you and I came out into a world where there was no tribe, what would this world be like? And then lately what we find out, one of the critical elements in living longer is having social connection. To this day. So it's no longer about surviving. It's just social connection helps us live longer. And people who have rich social connections generally live longer than people who don't. So a lot of that is not just emotional, or psychic, it's actually real. But there is something else that's interesting I found out in my research. So here we are, we find out that there's a piece of this that suggests that our neurology, our brain, basically is unable to hold close relationships with more than roughly 100 to 200 people. That's your max. The number is the general mean is around 150. And in fact, Malcolm Gladwell writes that people who have the capacity to go beyond that number are inevitably extremely successful. There's a business, it's actually the Gore-Tex business, the company that founded Gore-Tex. They found that in creating buildings, in manufacturing and planning and design, anytime a building went past 150, it created conflict in the building and productivity went down. 150 is this number. So instead of building one building, they build buildings with 150 people where they work together. So it's kind of an interesting slap in the face to the whole Facebook notion where we continue to build numbers and we still feel good about ourselves, right? Because that's a mythology. Past 150, what happens is we stop having compassion for the people outside of our 150. And that's really something that's very telling to me. Because if you don't know any, if 150 people, of that 150 that you are close to, that you configure, you literally have this paradigm where this 150 people have complex lives and problems. They're mortal, they're vulnerable. But their problems are different than mine, but my empathy is such, I haven't maxed out. And as a result, I can actually begin to at least try and relate to someone who is gay, who is black, who's Latino or Latina. If you're a man, that you have that relationship. Imagine having only men in your life. So you have that relationship to women. So this is really kind of a fascinating idea to me. The idea that we only have the capacity to hold empathy for about 150 people. Once we pass 150, we stop having empathy. We start creating hierarchical points of view, which means they're either more powerful than me or less powerful. I'm more successful, they're less successful, or vice versa. And inherently, that begins to create division and distinction. And so one of the reasons that we have tribes, and one of the reasons we lean into tribes, the theory goes, is because we simply can't comprehend more people. So we gather around this close-knit idea group that have similar values to ours. I'll tell you where all this is leading. I'm really kind of setting up maybe what is the problem initially, and then we'll get to the solution here. So what if, think about it, what if your 150 doesn't include diversity? What if it doesn't include people who are underserved in a majority? Majority is me, white, male. We hold the majority of the power. What if you don't have relationship to? What if your 150 doesn't include them? Then you fall into this trap. You fall into very limited perception. And that's the schism that we begin to see. Judging other people and applying our standards of behavior and idealism and beliefs to others in a very stereotypical way. Think about, if you will, and I said earlier, I'm not an anthropologist, but I do have a family. And that's a wonderful experience until you have teenagers. And I heard everyone talk about that before I had teenagers, and now I know what they were talking about. It's a very mixed experience. And yet fundamentally, let's think about functional families and non-functional. My mind as a father is that I hope to impart as many values that I think are altruistic and meaningful. I think their happiness is not as important as them doing good and making a positive difference and impact in our society. Happiness, I think, is overstated as the priority. I think the priority is that they somehow serve the greater good. But the whole point now is, as my oldest sons are leaving home soon, I have to no longer live through them. That in a sense, what I'm doing is preparing them to find their own way into the world. And whatever that way is, it should not reflect on me in the sense that I hold them to a certain standard, and only by them maintaining that standard do I feel good about what happened, or do I in some way control them. But that's not the case in all families. I don't think that I was even raised necessarily with that, at least from part of my family, which is they have a real stake in how you turn out. And if you don't meet their expectations, then somehow you get punished. You no longer you get punished either overtly or discreetly. And that's real. Now, what if we look at that, and you understand, am I being clear? So we really have family structures where we begin to create a certain subtle orientation, or maybe not so subtle, that kids need to behave a certain way and need a certain outcome in their behavior or the result of their actions and their profession in order to maintain the order of the family. Now, we all grow up with that tribe, right? We all grow up with a tribe called family. That's the first one. And then this amazing thing starts to happen. We start to individuate. And if you want to talk tribal, let's talk high school. So tribal, by the way, has a very different definition. This is tribal. Tribalism, loyal to a tribe or other social group. So that could be a family. Especially when combined with strong negative feelings for people outside the group. That's called tribalism. I'll read it again. Loyalty to a tribe or other social group, especially when combined with strong negative feelings for people outside the group. So we now enter high school. I don't know about your experience of high school, but mine briefly was there were the jocks, there were the cheerleaders. There were the bad cheerleaders. They were interesting. There were the... Remember bad cheerleaders? They were kind of interesting. Stoners, the USB, like the student body president and that whole, all their underlings, that kind of thing. The brainiacs, the misfits. In those days, I think they became like more of a goth kind of vibe. That's today. They were kind of hanging on the fringe of the fringe, wearing really, different clothes, really setting themselves apart. But they became a clique. They, again, got separated. And so if we start looking at how that evolution starts to happen, it never changes. Once we become established in that kind of clique mentality and tribal mentality, it may not be our family anymore. For some it is. That's one of them. But for many of us, we start moving in these directions. Now, why am I having this conversation with you? I'm a teacher. I've taught meditation and yoga for almost 40 years. Because all of this presupposes fundamental beliefs. And that is that this idea, this self-identification by determining how I'm different from everybody. I determine who I am by how much I'm not like somebody else. And then occasionally you meet people, you go, oh, I'm like them. But again, this idea of it is rooted in the is rooted in the concept of the experience of you are different. From a yoga perspective, we've gotten very attached to this idea of asking, who am I? What I'm going to suggest today is that you start asking, what am I? What am I? There's a phenomenal thing that happens to all of us, and that is that we go to sleep every day, hopefully. Every 24 hours, there's some time spent in sleep. And what happens in sleep? You disappear. You disappear. And your friends disappear. And your associations disappear. And the people you hate disappear. And the people you love disappear. For a brief time, and it's not so brief really, because it's roughly a third of our life, we dissolve. The differences dissolve. There's no tribe in the depth of meditation, just like in the depth of sleep. In fact, if you hang on to tribal ideas just as you're trying to go to sleep, you won't go to sleep. It's not until you release them that something special happens. Now, some people might argue that that's just oblivion. At that point, I'm just in ignorance. But sages don't say that at all. The sages say that when you're asleep, you're actually the closest to the real you that there is. That you're not confined. And I know in meditation, I know in the depth of meditation, in the depth of relaxation, all of those distinguishing characteristics disappear. And yet we wake up, and the moment we wake up, in this age, what do? You quickly grab for what distinguishes you. And how do you do it? Something like 60 to 70% of us grab for our smartphone within the first half hour that we're awake. By the way, the number now is we check our smartphones 84 times a day is the average. 84 times a day. And I would argue to you that most of it is tribalism. It's like, who is my group? We want to check in with the tribe. Who's familiar to me? Can they reinforce what distinguishes me? The fundamental illusion that I am who I hang out with. I am the kids I raise. I am my positioning at the speakeasy. I am the number of people that are in my class. And so, as a philosopher and as a teacher, what I'm going to suggest is there really is another approach. It doesn't mean to step away from society at all. It simply means that we begin to step into, one, a quality of understanding about the real value of tribes and their limitations. So there's this image. I read it probably close to 30 years ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago, I don't know. A book called The Book of Living and Dying. It's really an exceptional book written by a Tibetan Rinpoche. And he writes in this book two profound experiences he had early in his life about watching these Tibetan monks pass on. And in both instances, he kind of paints a picture which is fairly unique in Western civilization, which is that as a person would lay dying, in both instances that he describes, this person's teacher was there and essentially helps them pass. In essence, makes the passage of giving up life and transitioning as smooth and as effortless as it can possibly be. And in many of those traditions that Tibetan Buddhism rises out of, what they do with the body afterwards is they don't dig a hole and put the bones and the skin and what's remaining of the organs in that hole and then put a place where we go back and we continue to mourn it. But rather it's burned. The idea here is swaha, as close as we can get to dissolving it. Why? Because we are born alone and we die alone. And I would argue at this point that tribalism, the movement toward tribalism, the movement of division, has as much to do with our existential fears as it does as a way to survive. I hardly need anyone in this room or anyone to support me in order to survive. But if I turn to Facebook 84 times a day to check in with my tribe, that's about existential fear, which is I'm going to die alone. So in some way, if I can diminish that pending reality by reminding myself I'm connected, I'm connected, I'm connected, I'm liked, I'm liked, I'm liked. How many more for this particular picture? Like me. What it does is it creates this, one, it's based on the false understanding that you're not that. You're that which is at rest, which is never changing, which you get to when you're in the depth of meditation or in the depth of sleep, where there's no more distinctions, there's no more tribe, there's just you. There's just the reality, there's just the essence. And so what I would suggest now is that we begin to think along these lines of symbiosis as opposed to hypnosis. Symbiosis means, and this is how I look at my relationship to my family and raising my kids. Symbiosis means that for a time we work together for the greater good of whatever tribe we're a part of. With the knowledge, however, that the tribe will give us the gift of allowing us the freedom to exist and then to leave in an enlightened way. In other words, can we exist in a way that supports the tribe, supports the sustaining of culture and values? One of the groups I didn't read there was, and still, I don't know, from where I come from, my tribe mentality, log cabin Republicans. It's a misnomer to me. I don't really get it, but they exist. Gay Republicans. I don't really understand it, but it's okay. I don't have to understand it. But can we reach a point where we have the freedom within our tribe to have different opinions? Where we can stand outside the tribe and realize that we're not only what the values of this are, of this gathering is. That we continue to question the values of the tribe, and that when it's no longer working, we walk away. Symbiosis means I support the tribe while I'm part of it. And the tribe is going to support my individualism, my walking away, my empowerment. Right before the election, I heard our former president say something like this, and it was already beginning to show, there were already signs that voting was going to become somewhat more difficult, and of course in specific areas of the country, specific voting districts and things like this. And he said, be clear about this. He said, yes, voting is going to be hard for you. But the only one that actually is going to disempower you is you by not voting. So part of this, and I want to kind of wrap this up because there really is, obviously this is a 20-minute, 25-minute conversation that speaks to really big issues, culturally, politically, but really all I can do is, I'm not a social activist. That's not my thing. I'm a teacher. For me, yoga should be independent. Yoga should be a sanctuary. It should be a refuge for Republicans and Democrats. So this isn't a place where I want to assert political viewpoints overtly, nor tell you what causes to pursue. So let's just look at then, in my final kind of wrap-up, I had some ideas. And I just want to, obviously I've taken quite a bit of time to talk about the problems. First, I want to say this before I get to those final pieces. Number one, the teachings actually describe how to have a balanced view on life. A view that allows us to be more free, to be unburdened. Even while living in times where it's appropriate to feel there's this burden. They're almost like unsolvable problems while we continue the dialogue, while the dialogue continues as it is. So what can people who choose to meditate, to choose a spiritual path, a contemplative path, what can we do? And how do we work within this? So number one, I want to say that it's vital that we give up our animosity and our judgment. I had this strange experience during the election. I was teaching in London. I left the evening of the election from Chicago, and the first polling had just started to come in, but they didn't have any results. I looked at the television, got on the plane, and I was in the news-free zone. I spoke to a really incredible, amazing conversation on the flight over, about 3 hours worth. The two of us said goodnight, went to sleep. I woke up about, in that oxygen-deprived stupor that you get on airplanes about 4 hours later, and the hostess was walking down the aisle in a stupor, actually, kind of like ghost white look, and her eyes were kind of pinwheeling, and I said, this is what I said, is it the election? Something happened in the election? She said, he's going to win. And I kind of got my wits about me. That came as a surprise for a lot of people. Eventually, the gentleman next to me, and we were part of the same tribe. We were part of the same, he wasn't a yoga teacher, but we were in a similar tribe. And I told him, and we got off the plane, and he said to me, we went through passport control together, and he said to me, hey, I don't think you drink, but do you want to come for a drink? And I said, well, I'll come with you, but I won't drink. And I then was in London, totally away from my tribe. I called my wife as I got out of the airport. She was crying. My 8-year-old was crying because he has a young friend who was undocumented, his age. And he was crying because he assumed correctly that his parents were going to leave the country very quickly. And I was away from my tribe. I decided not to look at the news for 10 days. I decided to process things because in essence, I realized that all the time I had spent in my tribal news feed was all wrong. They had it wrong. And I decided that my own sensibility should rule the day, that I would meditate and rest and journal and think about where I stood. Not be reactive. I didn't go to Facebook. I didn't go to any kind of tribal access points. And I came back more at peace than anyone in my tribe. So how do you live? How can it be symbiotic? In other words, we don't step out of our relationship to family and friends and partners and people of like-mindedness. But how do we stand above it? Because in the end, you will die alone. That's the question. So here's some thoughts. Katie, you haven't held up a time thing yet for me. I'm getting there? All right, so number one, spiritual experience leads to greater inclusiveness. Spiritual experience leads to greater inclusiveness. And the fact is that when you get the original message of those people who have had spiritual experiences, Buddha, Jesus Christ. It's a long list. We could even argue Muhammad. When you look at the original rendering of their teachings, of their view, not the followers and the tribes that they begot long after they left, you hear total inclusiveness. This embrace of the poor, this embrace of the underprivileged. Constantly, it's the rule of really what defines us through the prism or through the light of spiritual experience is compassion and wisdom. Compassion and wisdom. Karuna and prajna. So, number one is if you are feeling subsumed in discomfort, in dislike, in hatred, in confusion, in trouble, in suffering, seek out spiritual experience. Seek out the dissolution of your own character, your own identification with what makes you uniquely, what makes your tribe, what makes you part of the tribe you belong to, or multiple tribes. Number two, really get it clear. You are more than the groups that you identify with. You are something else. And that's why I say maybe it's time to start asking ourselves, not this great spiritual epic question of who am I, but what am I? Am I really even a body? Am I something else? Ask yourself, if you feel disempowered, how much of that are you the source of? And I get it. Again, I'm a white guy, child of European parents. I won the lottery ticket. But I heard President Obama say that, which to me was so powerful. Understand that only you can disempower yourself at this point. I'll speak to that, I want to follow that up with a second idea as I get just about to the very end here. But please keep that in mind. Really do your best to identify how much am I doing the disempowering and how much is that being imposed on me by these other tribes. So check your victimization. Tribes, one of the things that they share in common very often, and especially in this day and age, is a common enemy. That almost makes us a tribe. If we hate the same person, we're almost together. So think about that. Think about and reflect on that. Neutralize your reactivity. So for all my Democratic friends, I've started a new contemplative exercise. It's one of the deeper spiritual practices I've ever done. I watch Fox News. Just when Democrats start getting very excited, liberals start getting super excited, that's when I say, let me see another point of view. And what I do is I stare at that until I'm non-reactive. It's an amazing meditation. It's an amazing meditation. So this is what Patanjali, this great sage, the great sage of yoga, says, that two things in order to overcome the obstacles to yoga, which is another way of just simply saying, how am I going to thrive? How can I thrive at my highest level? And two of the things that he calls out is that we have to eradicate judgment and we have to eradicate animosity. And by the way, I believe that you can be active and you can make a difference and you can move things forward. You can advance both yourself and our culture and our society, and you don't have to be angry. So one of the things he says as it relates to animosity, he says, in terms of the ones that we have animosity towards, is that understand where in your own life you are withholding love and understanding toward yourself. That your animosity is actually a symptom of not loving and understanding your own pain, not filling in the gaps, not filling in where you've been hurt and you haven't quite healed the wound. And that much of our anger is actually the result of us unattending to our own wounds. So rather than getting on this track, this tribal track of continuing your animosity and your anger and your frustration, Look at where you've been hurt and where you haven't healed the hurt. And in terms of judgment and condemnation, Patanjali offers this cure. He says, think about their current level of understanding. Whoever you are angry toward, or that you condemn, or that you judge, think about and take into consideration their level of understanding and the fact that they are in pain. Do you remember the 150 conversation? See, if we're stacked, then we don't have compassion anymore. And so we have to step back and be able to add at least 151 or 152 or 153 to our list and think that maybe someone who I'm absolutely livid toward, that it's pure vitriol, I need to think about the pain once inflicted upon them and their lack of understanding that generates their behavior that then sends me into this tribal uproar. So, again, I just want to say that in the end, in order for us to navigate fear, because that's really something I can speak of, we've got to look at it as a spiritual path. What is the spiritual path for this time? In some ways, it's not changed because there's social media or because of somehow technology. It's always been the same. The end of fear is the end of duality. Good and bad, right and left, black and white, male and female, young and old, straight and gay. But how do you access non-duality? That's your spiritual practice. And that's why more than ever, we want to think about how we infuse a kind of spiritual life into the midst of all of this divisiveness. And everything at our disposal is reinforcing duality, yet every time I go to sleep, I'm back into singularity, and it's so easy to forget that sleep is the closest reflection of who I am. The depth of meditation is the closest reflection of who I am and who I can be. So, it's a spiritual journey. I don't know of any other way to tell you that it isn't. And if I haven't made it clear where I think you go from here, practice some spirituality, practice some self-forgiveness and self-love. And finally, I do want to make the final case that democracy, as someone pointed out to me recently, is an amazing system, perhaps one of the best. But there will always be minorities within our system. And I would say that eventually, a true spiritual vision of how to live our lives is to pay attention to who's disenfranchised, who is not part of the majority. I think that's absolutely vital. And that will be an expression of a clear and pure heart, not tainted by anger and judgment. You will be moved to the disenfranchised. You will be moved and awoken to their needs. So, I'm hoping by the end of this talk, you will tune in to whatever tribe you've had the least sympathy for over the last 6 months or 8 months, and you will find that neutrality and non-reactivity, because that's where the truth and that's where the solution lies. Thank you.